Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. I have a bit of a sore throat today, so I'm going to try and keep this analysis short. Thankfully, it coincided with this chorale, which is on the short side, only 4 unique phrases. We're going to be looking at Herr, habe, missgehandelt today, which translates to Lord, to thee I make confession. Couple of interesting quirks in this chorale, couple of chord progressions that have room for interpretation, which is always interesting. We're just going to hop right into the analysis. So no key signature, we start on A minor, we end on A major. So I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is A minor. We move to A, C, E, and E, which is another A minor chord we don't need to reanalyze, passing 7th in the bass. Cool thing that happens here is a descending chromatic bass line. These are particularly rare in the chorales, but when they do pop up, it's always an interesting progression. Like, how does Bach really make it work? Because ascending chromatic progressions could just be a series of leading tones, but here Bach has to be a bit more creative in terms of making a progression that fits the sort of tonal practices of the time. And he does, surprisingly. Well, I guess actually not surprisingly at all. We have F sharp, C, E, and A here, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which is a byproduct of like the melodic minor scale, with the F sharp being the raised 6th scale degree. Interestingly though, we're seeing it follow a G natural rather than a G sharp. It's kind of interesting, gives it more of like an A Dorian vibe, but really the overall progression I don't think really speaks modally to me, because it is like a tonally normative progression in terms of the way the roots move, and we get G sharp in the not too distant future. But it's kind of interesting to see this descending pattern here where we go from G to F sharp then to F natural, rather than G sharp to F sharp then to F natural. I would expect a G sharp here, but conferring with the trusted edition that I use, it is in fact a G natural, so kind of an anomaly, but pretty cool. A is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have F, A, D, and B, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over F, which is 2, 4, 3, so 6 going to 2, very normative progression here. It's the way that we would expect the typical 6 chord to resolve. I mean, 6 is a pretty open-ended chord, it could really go anywhere, but if we're following that cycle of falling fifths pattern that we expect to see in Baroque music especially, but just as far as the way the roots are connected to one another, 6 typically goes to 2. But afterwards we have B and A, they're both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. Then we have a very interesting chord here. We have E, G sharp, and E. That's not super interesting, but we have a C natural. This is an augmented triad. This is C augmented over E, so this would be a 3 plus 6 chord, effectively being used as a sub for 5, right? Because we have the E major components and the supporting voices, but we have C natural here. And I feel like the big picture here is that this C is moving down towards this B, which is then going to move down towards this A, and this D is just a slight detour. But I think all in all, because of the metric placement of everything that's going on here, Bach still has some development to do before we get an introduction of the dominant. But he goes about getting to the dominant from 3 augmented. Pretty cool that it has its own isolated beat, and there's really nothing to mince about here because it's its own beat with really no passing tones or anything. That moves to F, A, and D, which is D minor over F, which is 4, 6. D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we have E, E, A, and B. This is sort of the cadential formula for 75% of this chorale. If you look in the second section, we're going to see a very rhythmically and harmonically similar progression for all of the authentic cadences in the chorale. But 4, 6 goes to 5, E, E, A, and B, this A being a 4, 3 suspension over the bass. Bach typically uses 4, 3 suspensions over the bass when we're talking about dominant chords, and 9, 8 suspensions tend to be for tonic triads. That's something that I've been noticing a lot more recently. And then G sharp is the resolution, D is a little delayed passing 7th, and our perfect authentic cadence concludes in the key of A minor. Next phrase ends in a half cadence, kind of an interesting form here where we go from perfect authentic and then ending the section with a half cadence. It's kind of unusual. Typically we would expect the grammar to be flipped around because a half cadence feels sort of like an incomplete ending, and the perfect authentic cadence rounds it out because it's ending on the tonic. But seeing them flipped is sort of like a complete sentence followed by a question almost. Interesting. This phrase is much more harmonically straightforward. We have A, E, A, and C. No need to reanalyze there. Then we have B, D, G sharp, and B, which is G sharp diminished over B. That's a 7/6 chord. And then we have C, E, A, and A, which is A minor over C, 1/6. 1/7/6, 1/6, very common pattern in Bach. We see it all the time. We even see the same sort of figure of one, or a chord a step below, and that same chord in first inversion, or the mirror of that, the inverse, all the time in Bach. It's one of the most common progressions we see to scaffold this stepwise bass movement. But after 1/6, we have G sharp, E, E, and B, which is E major over G sharp. That's 5/6, passing 7th in the tenor. And then we have A, C, E, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position, A minor. Then we have some more passing tones, this time in both of the lower voices, before we get F, A, and D. This is D minor in first inversion again. We saw it before. And now we are going to cadence on E major this time with E, B, G sharp, and E, our 5 chord. So this would be more specifically a Phrygian half cadence, and it's not super important. It's just something that I'm tracking to see how many half cadences are Phrygian half cadences in comparison to all the half cadences we see in Bach. A Phrygian half cadence is just a half step movement here in the bass from F going down to E in this case, or 6 going down to 5, and that's that half step movement is a sort of Phrygian sound, because the Phrygian mode is the only mode that, well, I mean, I guess the Locrian mode has it too, but Locrian is a diminished bass mode. It doesn't get a lot of use outside of just theorized usage. Phrygian mode got considerable amount more usage, especially in music that predated Bach, and this evoked that sort of sound, because it'd be very common to see sort of this movement of flat 2 going to 1 and the tonic being major. That mode mixture, if you will. So moving into the B section, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C, and I'm convinced that the entire section is in the key of C, or not the entire section, but the entire phrase is in the key of C. We have A minor, A, C, A, and E, which is our tonic triad in the key of A minor. It's also our 6th chord in the key of C major. And here we have a bit of an interesting chord here. I think that this is a... it's weird. I think that this could be analyzed as a 5/7 chord, where we have G, D, A, and F, and that this A is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. But I don't really know, actually, if that's, fully arguable, because also if we look at this G as an accented non-chord tone, we have F, D, A, and F, which is D minor in first inversion. We've seen a couple of D minor first inversion chords. That would be 2/6, 6/2, another normative progression. But the interesting thing here is that we see this go to E, D, G, and G, where this D is pretty clearly a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is a tonic triad in first inversion. So 2 going to 1, very unusual progression. But when you listen to this chord here on beat 2, it has sort of an ambiguous identity, and I can't quite put my finger on why exactly it sounds that way definitively, because I think it has more so to do with the chord afterwards rather than the chord itself, because this A feels a little bit out of place for me. I feel like it should be a B rather than an A. That's just me. I don't know if there's really any validity to that. It just sounds like an interesting chord here, but this F really seems to be, I guess, the chord tone in this context, and the fact that it's doubled in the outer voices is sort of indicative of maybe that D minor triad being in first inversion. I just found that kind of interesting. 2-1 is also a very interesting progression. I guess take it with a grain of salt as well, because there's movement in other voices as well. It's not as clear as, two chords that are moving from one to the other without other voices being altered in some way. But I digress. After our one chord, we have F, C, A, and C, which is our 4 chord, F major, tonic triad. That's our subdominant triad with a passing 7th on the bass. And here's a very interesting chord as well. For a shorter chorale, this is really proportionately filled with interesting chords. So I think we might be tempted to call this a D minor 7 chord, D, C, A, and F. But the way that I hear it with this A flat here, I think 2-7 is a very plausible analysis. I think this C is a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and if this C is a 7-6 suspension over the bass, this A is also functioning as a tone that is sort of like an accomplice to this C. So really it's these tones right here that I'm looking towards, and it sort of spells a chord that makes sense in the overall normativity of this progression, and that is B fully diminished 7th, B, D, where's the F? F and A flat. So we have some mode mixture going on here. More specifically, this would be 7, 6, 5 with the fully diminished symbol. So this chromatic passing tone, I think, is really the object of interest in this overall progression. With Bach, because of how close 2 and 7 are harmonically to one another, D, F, and A versus B, D, and F, they often get contextualized alongside one another. And I think in the overall grand scheme of the progression, it doesn't sound like 2 going to 7 to me. It really feels like the 7 chord supersedes the 2 chord. 2 going to 7, when you're thinking about all of the traditionally predominant and dominant functioning chords, you permutate all the 2s and the 4s and the 5s and the 7s. 2 going to 7 is objectively, and this is just objective like fact based on how tertian triads move from one to another, it's the weakest of the progressions, which is often why I would suspect they happen in this subdivided context, and 2 kind of gets overshadowed. A lot of the times it's really just one voice moving rather than 2 voices moving, and that plays a role in it not really feeling like a chord progression, but rather a chord that can be viewed as 2 or as 7, because I'm of the predisposition that a progression really needs more than one voice to move in order for the entire harmony to change. That's just the relationship I've formed with the material, but you might have a different opinion on it, and that's totally fine. We'll see another 7 chord later in the chorale that demonstrates this. It's also been demonstrated probably hundreds of times in my previous videos where I've analyzed chords that are either 2 or 7. It just depends on how you hear the voices move and which voice feels like it is taking precedence on the beat. A 4 chord, we would typically expect a dominant chord after 4 or a tonic chord after 4, and I feel like 7 being the case here makes a lot of sense, despite the fact that we have, the building blocks of a 2-7 chord happening here. I feel like 7 just makes more sense here, and with sort of a suspension operating under the hood here, and that sort of leading us to also looking at this A natural, this A natural as an accessory. They're actually both descending suspensions. It's just this one goes from a perfect 5th to a diminished 5th. That's unusual. And this one goes from a minor 7th to a major 6th, which is much more common. So this is definitely a unique case where we see this double suspension happening here, if we could even really call what's happening in the alto a suspension. Like I said, it's more of like an accomplice or an accessory to what's happening in the tenor, but it's a definitely very unique chord situation with this chromatic passing tone really playing a role in being, I think, part of the chord, and implying some mode mixture as well to the parallel minor, which is C minor, which is where this A flat I think is coming from. But after 7 we would expect a 1 chord, and we get it, E, C, G, and E, which is 1-6. 4-7-1, very common progression. Passing tone in the bass. And then we have G, C, G, and D. We've seen this pattern before with the 4-3 suspension over the bass with our 5 chord, delayed passing 7th. This is a G major chord, more specifically, before we cadence on C major, C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, last phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor, and I think we stay in the key of C for at least the first 3 beats. We start off with G major, G, B, G, and D, which is our 5 chord, passing 7th in the bass. And here's an interesting chord, and we've seen this a couple of times in Bach, the situation where we have a potential interpretation, sort of like the chords we've been seeing before, that, you know, there's some eighth notes happening. What notes are part of the chord? Is it a subdivided progression? All of the normal questions we typically ask of a texture that isn't just straight harmonic rhythmic notes. Here we have E, B, G, and that same D from before. And I think there's an argument to be made that this is an E minor 7 chord, but I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually G major over D, and this is just a passing sort of G major idea. The reason why I really feel that way is that the upper voices are just spelling a G major triad, and it feels like really G major carries through here and E gets sort of caught in the crossfire. That's just how I feel about this particular progression. I don't think it's super important whether this is E minor 7 or G, because you can't spell an E minor 7 chord without G. Maybe this E is even operating as the 13th of the chord. I don't know. All in all, I just feel like this is a big G major statement that's being made, because ultimately it resolves to C major, C, C, G, and E major, which briefly gets turned into first inversion on this beat because E and G. Oh no, you know what? I take that back. That gets rid of the root of the chord, so it's almost like we get an E minor triad here, but it's incomplete, so I'm not going to mark it. Coincidentally, I think this is also where we go to A minor, and C becomes our 3 chord, and 3. One of the more common places for 3 to go is 4 in Bach's harmonic writing, and that's what we see here. We have D, we have D, F sharp, and A, which is our 4 chord. It's not a secondary dominant. This F sharp is part of the melodic minor scale. And again, we're seeing G natural go to F sharp, and then we're seeing F sharp being contextualized as an ascending sort of scale degree in this melodic minor fragment here. So 4 is uppercase because it's a major chord, or because it has a major third between the root and the third of the chord. Afterwards, passing 7th in the bass, neighbor tone here in the alto. We then have B, D, F sharp, and D, which is, I went at length about talking about why this, I think, is a 7 chord, not a 2 chord. This is a much more traditional case of 2 versus 7. We have one voice that is a series of notes that are a step apart. We have F sharp, and we have G sharp. So if we take the F sharp as the chord tone, it's a 2 chord. 4 going to 2, not really a normative progression. Really, the idea of a normative progression is more so me thinking about the big picture, about how harmony is functioning and how we're getting to the tonic. And if the leading tone is present, I think it tends to have stronger sway over the role of this chord harmonically. So even though the notes for a 2 chord are in the chord, right, with the F sharp and the B and the D, and remember this would be a minor chord because this is not an F natural, it's an F sharp, and that's just a byproduct of harmonizing the melodic minor scale. I think this G sharp is actually our chord tone, and this is actually a 7-6 chord. 4 going to 7 is a much more normative progression, and the fact that it resolves to a tonic on the other side, I think that that's the big picture. It's not that any one analysis is correct. I think that if you didn't have the same relationship with the harmony that I do, you could easily say this was a 2 to 7 subdivided progression, because you have on the end of the beat the 7 chord, and on the beat itself the 2 chord, and that in and of itself could create a little subdivided progression. But I think if you get that granular with your chord progressions, you run into some specificity, at least in my cases, you run into some specificity issues about, what chords are which every single time you have a voice that moves a step away, and how that interprets. So I'm really analyzing for the big picture in a lot of cases to try and keep the analysis as clear as possible. And remember, the Baroque era was a time where the texture was largely contrapuntal, but the harmonic material was functional, and you didn't have as clear chords as you did in like Mozart, for example. And so sometimes you have to be a little creative in terms of how you pull things out of the texture. This F sharp creates an interesting moment that then leads to what the actual harmony is. So you got to be creative sometimes. I feel like this is the overall resulting sound and what harmonies are being implied, but like I said, there's always room for interpretation in terms of, what key we're in or what chords are happening when we're in situations like this, right? But this does resolve the same way that our former 4-5-1 progression resolves, and it actually happens in the same point metrically too. I know they're sort of offset by one another because this phrase is a bit longer than the second phrase, but it's happening at the same point. So I feel like perhaps there is some symmetry going on between the first phrase of the B section and the last phrase of the B section. But afterwards we get A, E, A, and C, tonic triad, A minor, and then we go to E major. We're very familiar with this cadential structure from this chorale because it happens 3 times. E, E, A is that 4-3 suspension, and B, which is implying our 5 chord a little bit early. We then have the G sharp, E, E, G sharp, and B. That's the resolution. A little delayed passing 7th here, and our major tonic triad, A, C sharp, E, and A. Tonic triad, root position. That's today's analysis. A couple of takeaways from this chorale. We have an augmented triad, that's pretty cool. Descending chromatic bass line, that's always very interesting. Chromatic bass lines in general are something that I've been keeping track of in the chorales, but descending chromatic bass lines are far less common than ascending chromatic bass lines, so it's always a treat when we encounter one, and it's actually a normative progression, which is pretty cool. Got some potential mode mixture going on with this fully diminished 7th chord here on beat 1 of this phrase, or this measure of this phrase, and a potential 2-1 progression. 2 going to 1, kind of a weak progression. Adjacent chords that go down a step. Typically we see, things go like 4 to 5, 3 to 4, 7 to 1. Chords that are adjacent to one another typically, especially when they are in the same inversion, right? Like root position chords that are adjacent to one another typically go up. That's just generally how we see they go up. But here we're seeing them go down, and when we see like 2 go to 1 in that context, I think it's interesting. Maybe it's not super interesting to you, but to me it's a root movement that we don't typically see, because we are approaching the tonic from one stable chord to another, and typically when we see that, it's usually 4 going to 1, sort of like a plagal sound, but there's really no reason why 2-6 also can't, take that role. It's basically the same chord. It's just uncommon from a spelling standpoint. Like we typically see 4 do that, not 2. Just an observation based on my experience, maybe not super significant to you. Just thought that I would share it. But that is today's analysis. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting my channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.